The well at the Mercer place went bad the same week they buried Tom Mercer, and the town of Hollis decided the two things were of a piece. It happened in the dry end of summer, in the year of 1884, on a quarter section of hard ground east of town that everyone called Bitter Creek Flat, though the creek it was named for had not run in living memory. Tom went down with a fever on a Tuesday and was in the ground by Friday, and on the Sunday after, Della Mercer dropped her bucket down the well behind the house and drew up water the color of weak coffee, threaded with grit, with a film on it that caught the light wrong. She boiled it. She let it stand. She strained it through clean muslin twice. It still came up brackish, and it still smelled faintly of something turned, and a woman who took in washing for her living cannot wash a banker's shirts in water that smells of something turned. So Della learned the exact weight of a full bucket, carried 1.25 miles, 38 pounds, near enough. She learned it the way a person learns a wound, not by being told, but by carrying it, dawn after dawn, from the public pump in the town square back across the flat to her own dry yard, one bucket in each hand, and her shoulders burning by the halfway fence. If you have spent any time on the frontier, you know there was nothing unusual in a hard season. What was unusual was how quickly a tired town does its arithmetic on a widow. Hollis was not a cruel place. It was a careful one. A young woman with no people, no money, and a soured well is a sum a careful place adds up only one way, and the answer kept coming back the same. Not ours. Mrs. Iva Pruitt, who kept the front counter at the Mercantile and the back fence of every reputation in the county, put it plainest. She said it by the pump one morning, not quite to Della and not quite away from her, in that voice women use when they mean to be overheard. "A body's got to wonder," she said, "how long the widow Mercer means to draw on the town's water before she draws on the town's charity." And the two women beside her looked at the trough and not at Della, and Della set her full buckets down and picked them up again and walked the 1.25 miles home without a word, because the only thing worse than carrying water that far is letting them see it cost you. Now, I'll tell you something, and I'd ask you to stay with me through the cold part of this story, because the warm part is the part I've been waiting to tell you. And if you've ever known what it is to be measured by a town and found wanting, you already understand why a full bucket can undo a person faster than an empty one. If a story like this one is how you spend your quiet evenings, the bell tells the rest of us where to send the next one. And do let me know, before we go on, what corner of the country you're listening from tonight. Amos Ware ran cattle on the section that bordered the Mercer claim to the north, and Amos Ware had the only sweet water for 6 miles in any direction. There was a spring on his place, low in a fold of ground, that his father had found with a forked willow branch 30 years before, and over it Tom Ware, and then Amos, had built a stone-curbed well so cold and so clean that men rode out of their way in August just to drink from his dipper. Amos was a widower himself, though he wore it quietly, the way he wore everything. He was a man in his middle 30s, lean and weather-browned, slow to speak and slower to be hurried, and the town's opinion of him was that he was decent and dull, which in Hollis amounted to the same thing. What the town did not know, because Amos took the back road and left before the roosters, was that on the third morning after Tom Mercer's funeral, Amos Ware had ridden past the Mercer gate on his way to check his north fence and seen a thin figure in a faded blue dress hauling 2 buckets up the long rise from town, stopping at the halfway fence to rest her arms, and going on. He had reined in. He had watched a moment, and then he had ridden home and filled a clean tin bucket from his own sweet spring and ridden back and set it down inside her gate before the light was full, and gone, without knocking, without a note, before she ever came out. She found it at sunup, She stood over it a long time. She lifted the dipper and tasted, and the water was so cold and so clean, it made her teeth ache. And for one moment Della Mercer, who had not let the town see her cry, had to put the back of her wrist to her mouth and stand very still in her own dry yard until the moment passed. She told herself it was a mistake. A cowhand watering his horse, careless, leaving a bucket. She used the water. A woman who washes for pennies does not pour out sweet water on her pride. And she scrubbed the Hartley sheets and the doctor's collars and hung them snapping white on the line, and she thought no more of it. Until the next dawn, when there was another full bucket inside the gate, and the dawn after that, and the dawn after that. She started watching for it. She would not have admitted that, even to herself. But she began to wake in the blue dark before the sun and lie listening. And one morning she heard it, the soft chuckle of water, and the small honest knock of a tin pail set down gentle on wood, and a horse's hoof shifting in the dust, and then nothing. By the time she got to the window, there was only a rider's back going north in the half-light, a wide-brimmed hat, a man who did not once look behind him. It went on like that for the better part of 2 weeks before she stopped him. She rose in the full dark, wrapped her shawl, and stood waiting at the gate. And when Amos Ware came around the fence corner with the bucket swinging from his hand, he pulled up short, like a boy caught. They looked at each other across the rail in the gray light. "You'll be where?" she said. "I will," he said. "You've been leaving water." "I have." He set the bucket down inside the gate, the way he had every morning, and straightened and turned the brim of his hat once in his hands. "You've a long haul from town. I've more water than I've got use for. Didn't seem worth troubling you over." "Folks will talk," Della said. "A man carrying water to a widow's gate before light." Amos looked off toward the brightening line of the hills and considered that, and said in the plain, unhurried way that was the whole of him, "Folks talk whether you give them a reason or not. I'd as soon they talked about a full bucket as an empty one." He touched his hat. "Mornin', Mrs. Mercer." And he was gone before she could decide whether she was angry or whether, for the first time since the fever took Tom, something in the center of her had come unlocked half an inch. He did not stop coming, but now, some mornings, she was at the gate, and they would exchange 6 words about the weather, or the price of beef, or whether her line would dry before the dust kicked up. And he would set the sweet water down and take the empty pail from the night before and carry it home to fill again, so that the bucket itself went back and forth between their 2 places like a slow, patient pendulum, dawn and dusk and dawn. She mended a tear in his coat once, where the fence had caught it and gave it back folded, and he wore it the rest of the winter and never said a word. But he wore it. There was a morning in November when one of Amos's hired men, a boy named Pelham, caught his hand between a gate and a green colt and mashed 2 fingers to pulp, and it was Della Mercer they brought him to, because the word had gone quietly around that the widow Mercer knew more of healing than old Doc Whitford knew of staying sober. She set the boy's hand in a basin of the sweet cold water Amos had carried that very dawn, and she drew the dirt out of it with a poultice of her own making, and she splinted the 2 crushed fingers straight with whittled cedar and clean rag, talking low and steady to him the whole time so he would not pull away. The boy kept his hand and the full use of it. Amos stood in her doorway through all of it with his hat in his 2 hands and watched her work, the sureness of her, the calm in her voice. And he did not say anything, because Amos never said the large things. But something in his face had moved by the time he left, and Della saw it, and looked away, and felt her own face go warm in a manner it had not gone warm in a long, long while. It was after that he stayed, one dusk, when he came for the empty pail. She had the coffee on, and the smell of it reached the gate, and she heard his steps stop, and before she had quite decided to, she had said through the open door that there was a cup if he wanted it. He wanted it. He sat on the step, not inside, careful of her name even with no one by to talk, and they drank their coffee in the falling dark and spoke of small things, of his sister back in Ohio, of the cottonwood, of how a person comes to a hard country, meaning only to pass through, and is surprised to find they cannot leave it. When he rose to go, he stood a moment too long at the gate, turning his hat, and said only, "I'm glad of the company, Mrs. Mercer." And she said she was glad of it too, and found she meant it down to the soles of her feet. The winter came on, and the ritual held. A full bucket at dawn, an empty one at dusk, and between them 100 small wordless kindnesses no one in Hollis would have credited if you told them. He took to leaving other things quiet beside the bucket, a brace of quail, a sack of his own seed potatoes, and once a length of good wool he said had been his late wife's and would only go to moth in his trunk, and would Mrs. Mercer make some use of it. She made herself a dress of it, a deep, soft blue, and the first morning she wore it to the gate, he looked at her a moment longer than his usual 6 words allowed, then looked at his boots and said, "The weather looked like holding," and she said yes it did, and neither of them was talking about the weather. The town, of course, talked. Mrs. Pruitt talked the most. There was a respectable man in it, too, a land speculator named Harlan Vance, who had come out from Kansas City with a clean coat and a soft hand, and an eye for quarter sections that could be had cheap from people who could not hold them. Vance had looked at Bitter Creek Flat and seen what a dry claim with a soured well and a widow on it was worth, which in his ledger was very little, and he meant to have it for that very little. And he could not understand why the widow Mercer would not see the sense in selling to him and sparing herself. He began to call on her with papers. He began, when she would not sign, to remind the town, gently in his soft Kansas City way, that a claim with no working well was hardly a claim at all, and that charity to such a woman was only postponing the inevitable. Then, in the deep of February, the Pruitts' youngest took the throat fever. It went through the back rooms of Hollis the way fever does, quick and quiet and then all at once, and old Doc Whitford was 40 miles north with a broken leg of his own, and the boy burned and could not swallow, and Iva Pruitt, who had measured the whole county and found it wanting, sat by her son's bed and found that she could not measure this. It was Della Mercer they finally sent for in the black middle of the night, because everyone in a frontier town knows who the real healers are, even when they will not say so by daylight, and Della came. They had sent the blacksmith's boy out on a lathered horse to fetch her, hammering at her door at 2 a.m. with the news that the Pruitt child was choking and could not get his breath, and Doc Whitford was 40 miles off with his own leg broke, and would she come? Would she please come? And Della Mercer, who owed Iva Pruitt exactly nothing in this world but a long memory of a public shaming at the pump, was dressed and had her satchel of simples in her hand before the boy had finished the asking. She did not think twice about it. A sick child was a sick child. That was the whole of her arithmetic, and it had only ever had the one answer. She had nursed her own mother and 2 neighbors and her own husband, God rest him, and she knew the throat fever, and she knew that the one thing that Case needed, beyond the steam and the poultice and the long sitting up, was clean water. Gallons of it, boiled and cooled and spooned between cracked lips through a whole night and a whole day and another night. And the town's pump in February had frozen, It was Amos Ware who broke the ice on his own spring with an axe at 2 in the morning and hauled it in milk cans on a sledge through the snow, load after load, and stood in the Pruitts' cold yard, handing in bucket after bucket of water so clean it steamed, while inside Della Mercer kept a boy alive with it, one spoonful at a time. What that night cost, no one wrote down. She did not leave the bedside for 30 hours. She kept the steam going and the poultice fresh and the water moving. A spoonful, a rest, a spoonful. While the wind threw snow against the glass and Eva Pruitt knelt on the far side of the bed with her hands knotted in her apron, saying nothing now, only watching the woman she had shamed work to keep her son in the world. And every time the basin ran low, there was Amos at the cold back door with another bucket steaming in his 2 hands, his coat gone stiff with ice, his face gray with cold and the want of sleep, asking nothing, saying only, "More?" And Della would nod, and he would turn and go back out into the dark for more. By the second dawn, the fever broke. The boy slept, and Eva Pruitt walked out into her own yard, where Amos was unloading the last can, and looked at the woman she had shamed at the pump standing exhausted in her doorway, with her sleeves wet to the elbow. And Eva Pruitt, who had never in her life been known to do it, put her face in her hands and wept, and then she crossed the yard and took the widow Mercer's red and chapped and capable hands in both of hers, and could not, for a while, say anything at all. That was the turn of it. Not because the town suddenly grew a heart, towns don't, but because a thing had been done in the open that couldn't be unseen. They had all watched a widow they'd written off keep their child alive on borrowed water. And they had all watched the quiet, dull neighbor break ice in the dark to bring it to her. And a town that has watched that cannot go back to its old arithmetic. When Harlan Vance came around the next week with his papers and his soft reminders about a claim with no working well, it was the storekeeper and the blacksmith and 3 men who owed Amos Ware money or favors who happened to be standing on the mercantile porch, and they let Mr. Vance understand, without quite saying it, that the widow Mercer's water troubles were a Hollis matter now, and not a Kansas City one, and that he might find the air around Bitter Creek Flat had turned unfriendly to a man in a clean coat. Vance left on the Thursday stage. What Amos Ware did took longer. All through the back of that winter, on the short, cold afternoons when the cattle were fed and the light was failing, Amos walked the Mercer claim with a forked willow branch held loose in his 2 hands, the way his father had taught him, back and forth across the dry ground, patient as weather. Della watched him from her window and did not ask. And one gray afternoon in the first week of March, on the low ground behind the house not 80 yards from her own soured well, the willow branch dipped in his hands and turned down hard, and Amos Ware drove a stake into the frozen dirt and looked up at the window where she stood and tipped his hat. He sank the well himself, with the help of every man in Hollis who had a child, or a conscience, which by then was most of them. They dug through the thaw, cribbing the sides with green oak as they went down, and at 19 feet they came into sand, and at 22 feet the sand turned dark and wet, and at 24 feet on a bright cold morning at the very start of spring, the water came up into the hole clear and sweet and cold enough to ache, and the men whooped and Eva Pruitt cried again, easier this time, and Della Mercer stood at the lip of her own new well on her own dry claim, and watched her own sweet water rise to meet her, and she did not put her wrist to her mouth this time. She let them see her face. Amos Ware came to her that evening at the gate, where the whole thing had started, with the dented tin bucket in his hand. The same bucket, gone soft at the seams now from a winter of dawn and dusk. And he set it down between them one last time, and turned the brim of his hat once in his hands, the way he always did, And he said it the only way he knew how, which was plain. "You've your own water now," he said. "You don't need me coming round before light." He looked at the bucket and then at her, and the steady kindness in him did not waver, but something underneath it did. "I find I'd like to keep coming round anyhow, not with a bucket. As a man calls on a woman he means to marry, if she'd have him. I'm slow and I'm dull, and the town will tell you both, and they're not wrong. But I'd carry water to your gate every dawn of my life, Della, even with a well not 80 yards off, just for the morning's worth of seeing you at it." And Della Mercer, who had not let a tired town see her beg, and had not let a hard winter see her break, looked at the dented bucket and the plain weathered man, and the new well shining behind them in the last of the light, and she found that the thing in the center of her that had come unlocked half an inch that first cold dawn was all the way open now, and would not close again. "Mr. Ware," she said, and her voice was steady, the way it always was, "I've been waiting at that window for you longer than I'd ever say out loud." She picked up the bucket and put it in his 2 hands and folded her reddened fingers over his. "Fetch the water if you like, but you'll come in for breakfast after, every dawn. That's the price." They were married in May, under the cottonwood by the new well, and Iva Pruitt baked the cake, and the whole tired, careful town of Hollis came out to Bitter Creek Flat to watch a widow they'd written off marry the dull, decent neighbor who'd never once let her carry her own water, and to drink every one of them from the sweet cold well he'd witched and they dug in the yard where it had all begun with a single full bucket set down in the dark. They say on that place now, 2 generations on, that the well has never once run dry, not in the worst of droughts, and that the family keeps an old soft-seamed tin bucket hung on a peg by the kitchen door that no one is allowed to throw out. And if you ask why, the old ones will tell you it's because that bucket is the truest thing anyone in that family ever owned. Because on the frontier, where a tired town does its hard arithmetic on the people who can least afford it, the kindest thing a person can do is the quietest. To say nothing, to ask nothing, to simply rise in the cold before anyone is watching and carry sweet water to a gate and set it down and let it speak. What's the smallest kindness anyone ever did for you? The quiet one, the one they never made a fuss over, that you've never once forgotten. Tell me about it. I'd dearly like to know.